Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. I'm delighted to have one of our contributors, Andrew Weissmann. Welcome
Great.
back.
Great to be here.
Well, unfortunately, we keep meeting under very adverse circumstances. Kash Patel, the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Richard Durbin, wrote a letter and he said he'd received some disturbing information regarding Kash Patel. What was that? And what's the problem now for Kash Patel's confirmation?
Sure. So, first on the meeting like this, I unfortunately think, Jen, that we will be doing this for 4 years and hopefully only 4 years.
Yes.
So here's the issue. Kash Patel, when he had his confirmation hearing, was asked questions about what was going on at the Department of Justice and what was rumored to be going on at the FBI. And pointedly, he was asked by Senator Booker, do you know anything about firings or potential firings at the FBI? And he said definitively, no, I don't. I'm not aware of that. He was asked, did you participate in any way in what's going on? And he said no. He also said that with respect to any sort of employment action at the FBI, he would adhere to all the FBI internal processes, which I know very well. I was the general counsel of the FBI for a couple of years under Director Mueller. By the way, I always make a point of making it clear which director I served under, for maybe obvious reasons for our listeners. And so that is the record that they had. That is testimony under oath. At the time, I think a lot of people were wondering, what did Senator Booker know? Because he seemed to intimate that he was aware of something. And then, of course, another shoe dropped, and we became aware of actions not just with lawyers and prosecutors at the Department of Justice, but also many people at the sort of top floor, the seventh floor of the FBI being fired. Other people you can tell essentially you can voluntarily resign, and if you don't, you're fired. And then this collection of thousands of names of people to create a list for looking at employment action of those people on the list if they had any role whatsoever in the righteous January 6th investigations. And there also was a lot of talk that they were on the seventh floor, that Kash Patel had people there who were sort of aligned with him. And so that it seemed unlikely that all of this was happening at the Bureau, and everyone kept it from him. Well, that is the problem, that Senator Durbin, in a letter that people can see for themselves, it's all over the web now and social media, on major news outlets, and Senator Durbin reports very concrete information from what appear to be whistleblowers. I assume it's people at the FBI. And, the FBI, I know this, they travel with green notebooks. And when you go to meetings, they sort of take notes. They're trained to do that. They do that with witnesses, and they do that with internal meetings, and they take notes. And the notes indicate that in conversations with Stephen Miller at the White House, that Kash Patel was not just aware, but was directing that these employment actions take place at the FBI, and that what happened at the FBI should be comparable to what's happening at the Department of Justice. So there's the rub, that there appear to be FBI witnesses who would be able to testify completely opposite to what Kash Patel said under oath. So that's the most immediate thing. I do want to just put this quickly in context to say, remember, there are a million and one other reasons that Kash Patel
Yes.
is not fit. I mean, remember, he said that the FBI was the agency that fomented and was behind the January 6th attacks. Of course, it's a little bit of cognitive dissonance, because at one side he says January 6th is great, that the attacks were great, and the other it's like, no, it was bad, but the FBI did it, not the people who were prosecuted. But in any event, it's a lie that the FBI, or should say it's not true, let's put it that way, that the FBI was behind the January 6th attacks. I mean, it's just preposterous. So there are a lot of other reasons to not confirm him,
Yes.
but this is a real problem.
Right. So the testimony was such that it was so definitive. It was not, I don't know, or there may have been. It was so definitive. You rarely, frankly, get witnesses who are this certain, no qualifications. So now the issue is, what did he know? When did he know it? What did he do? What should, in your estimation, the Senate do? Should they bring him back under oath? Should they call these other witnesses? What's the next step?
So if I were either a Democrat or a Republican on this committee, and I took my oath seriously for advice and consent, what you would do is you would obviously have a conversation with Senator Durbin about who are these people and would any of them testify so that we can, I mean, these are allegations. You'd want to know what is behind them and what is there. And also there's written material. So you'd want to get your hands on that written material. That seems quite possible to do even within whistleblower protections. Remember, Senator Grassley is all about protecting whistleblowers. So this is a good example of being able to do that and calling on him to do that. And also, the FBI is an institution until Trump that, it's not a perfect institution, but it had a lot of support along, bipartisan support. And it was very important to Director Mueller to have that and to be seen as apolitical because it is apolitical. So I think that would be step one. And then step two would be to bring Kash Patel back and ask him for his explanation. And because he's entitled to due process also to say, here's the information, here's what's been reported. What do you have to say? Did you not remember? How could you not remember this? Are you saying these witnesses are lying? I mean, what is your explanation? And he's entitled to that, but the American public is entitled to that answer.
Right. And I want to stress something. He's not currently employed. He has no right to this job. He has to earn the trust. And if there is doubt in the minds of senators, they needn't confirm him. If he refuses to return or he gives some bogus explanation, you have to earn this position, which is extremely important. We're talking here about the leading investigative agency, the creme de la creme of law enforcement in the United States, which is the FBI. Is he going to just try to bulldoze his way through this? Is the Senate, you think, going to allow him to just kind of keep going and screen out what he considers to be noise?
So I love the point that you made. I have made that point when Supreme Court confirmations come up where it's like, wait a second, this is a privilege and an honor. No one has a right to be on the Supreme Court. This is something where we as the public, these people are going to work for us. They are public servants. And having been a public servant, to me, that's the thing you always have to remember, that it's a privilege to be in that position. And so we're entitled to those answers. We're entitled to the Senate, they're also public servants, to do their job. I don't know whether this will be yet another example of might makes right, where there are Senate Republicans, not all, but there are a lot of Senate Republicans who will just stick their head in the sand and don't want to take a stand for a whole variety of reasons. But I can't say I'm hopeful, but I think there's no question that is something that their job requires. And if they don't do it in this situation, then they continue the trajectory of the presidency, the executive branch, getting more and more powerful. Congress basically abdicating its role. And that's why we're seeing the only check currently that's going on, other than the media, is which has the bully pulpit, but no power otherwise, is the courts. And this, by the way, I was talking with Mary McCord about this, this is for the lawyers who are listening to this. If you read Justice Jackson's famous concurrence in Youngstown, and Justice Jackson was on the Supreme Court, but famously before that, he was the lead prosecutor in the Nuremberg trials. And his concurrence, which is very, very famous in Youngstown, talks about the trajectory of the executive. And remember, this is in the middle of the 20th century. He was talking about this. It's only gotten worse. How the executive has gotten more and more powerful in a way that the framers couldn't have contemplated. And from his experience, and you know where he's coming from, he talks about the how wary the courts and the public have to be because of that concern that there's supposed to be three branches. There's supposed to be checks and balances in divided government. And so, we are seeing the ignoring of that lesson from history play out in front of our eyes right now.
Before we switch gears somewhat, I just want to underscore that the perception now is something was off here. And if he is allowed to step into that role, he will be perceived within that building in a very negative fashion. He will enter with a cloud over his head, even if he gets through, even if the Senate doesn't confirm him. So it really should be in his interest and in the president's interest not to enter the building with the perception that he has not been truthful with the United States Senate under oath. Let me switch gears a bit to Eric Adams. Eric Adams was indicted by the Southern District of New York, often considered the toughest office of the U.S. Attorney. 5 counts, including bribery. It's a classic foreign corruption case. And today, he has been told, we're going to forget about that for a while. Now, this was not a review of the evidence. There was no witness who died. There was no evidence that disappeared. It wasn't that an agent investigating perjured himself. It was a really weird reason. What happened?
Yeah, so Émile Beauvais, the same person who has issued a lot of these memos about the FBI and the Department of Justice and has caused this huge schism with the FBI that's pushing back on with respect to the rule of law. Émile Beauvais issued a letter that is now public that is a directive to the Southern District of New York to dismiss the case. There are a number of things to note about it. One is he said, I am not saying that it is not factually accurate or that there's a problem with the law. So that already was like red flags. Because it's not about, you know what, we reviewed the facts and it's not there, or we think you got the law wrong. He explicitly in this letter says we're not saying that. Instead, he gives 2 reasons. And the first reason is he said that essentially you brought this too soon or too close to the primary season. That's just the polite term. Bunk. There is an unwritten so-called 60-day rule that has to do with actual elections, not primaries. But this wasn't even 60 days within the primary. So there just isn't any, that's just a made-up argument. It just, to me, I keep on thinking of the Rod Rosenstein memo that was written to justify Trump firing James Comey. Right. Rod Rosenstein's reasons were actually there, at least to his credit. Those reasons were actually good. They just were not actually at all relevant to why he was being fired. It was like something that justified firing Comey months and months ago, but it was not anything that was why it was happening. Here, saying that you just did it too soon or too close to the election, that's polite term, BS. The second reason was the one that's really outrageous. This indictment, they said, is interfering with Eric Adams' ability to implement Donald Trump's immigration policies. Here's the rub. First of all, that's not Eric Adams' job, is not to implement federal policy. He's entitled to do what he wants. He can't obstruct it. I mean, but he doesn't actually have to implement it. The memo, though, is ordering the Southern District to dismiss the case without prejudice, meaning that it could be rebrought. And the memo actually talks about that this is something that will be revisited down the road. So you now have, I mean, this is like a classic extortion scheme. I mean, it's like a quid pro quo. It's like, and we'll see how good you are and how you do. And remember, Eric Adams has been sucking up like crazy to Donald Trump. And he's now reaped this benefit, but they're keeping a tight leash on him, saying, we'll see what happens. And if you don't do our bidding, these charges obviously could reappear. Famously, final note on this is on Monday, a whole bunch of the commissioners in New York were called to a meeting with Eric Adams, the mayor of the city, where they were told, according to reports, that they are not to speak ill of Donald Trump. Now, there could be legitimate reasons for that. The city gets grants, et cetera. But there also could be illegitimate ones, which is that the
Yes.
mayor is under indictment and wants something from the president. And so the conflict is just outrageous. And the perception and I think reality of what's going on is just it's just incredible. I mean, this is so against the rule of law. It's basically if you suck up to him, this is what you get. And they're doing it in a way that is, I mean, talk about interfering with the electoral process in Manhattan,
Right.
which they don't seem to give a damn about.
I want to add 3 points to what you just said. First of all, Eric Adams went down to Mar-a-Lago. So this was a case in which apparently, I would be shocked if they didn't discuss this. He actually went and was pleading, his case. Second, I have never heard of an instance in which a prosecutorial decision was reversed for an unrelated political reason. It's not, I'm having trouble enforcing the bribery laws, or I need you because you're a witness in a bribery law. This is, you're indicted for X crime, but I really want you to be doing Y for me instead. I've never heard of this in all the years in any prosecutorial office in any kind of prosecution. Have you?
Well, Jen, I was going to say you haven't heard of it in America.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, if you
Yes.
were in Russia or in Ukraine, oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah.
It is not what
Exactly.
happens in this country.
Exactly. And the last thing I would say is the people of New York do get a vote. And he is up for reelection, and theoretically, they could vote him out. What happens then? He gets indicted because he could no longer help the president. It's a way of kind of leaning on the people of New York as well. And frankly, I don't know. I know you know New Yorkers better than I. Do you think they're going to take kindly to this, that their mayor is now potentially under the thumb of Donald Trump, who is overwhelmingly not popular in New York City?
Yeah, so I'm going to speak just for myself. I'm a New Yorker. I vote as a New Yorker, and no, I don't think that people are going to take kindly to it. And just as somebody who was in the Department of Justice for years, but I think it's true for any citizen, it is outrageous to be doing this, and with all appearances of this being a quid pro quo. I'm going to add one other point, which is, Eric Adams, just in terms of his popularity and sort of like how people will take this, the claim that he is subject to a witch hunt and he was persecuted. He's a Democrat.
Yes.
I
Yes.
mean, this is just taking it to like ridiculous extremes. Yes, yes, the Biden administration, the administration that prosecuted Hunter Biden and Senator Menendez, they went after him as a witch hunt, and because what, he's a Republican? No, he's a Democrat. So
Yes.
the idea of he's like trying to say, "Oh, I'm just like you," is really outrageous. And there's also, I have to say, there's also sort of this racial component that it's just hideous to think of this sort of very white regime that's come into power of like mainly white men. And this, you can just see there are a lot of policies that are either intentionally or certainly have the effect of being adverse to Black and Brown communities. And here, this idea of we're going to have one of the few Black mayors of the largest city in the United States, I believe it's still the largest city in the United States, being under the thumb of the president just has a look
Wrong.
and feel that is really, we should be well beyond in this country.
I think even if you're not a lawyer, even if you don't know all the ins and outs, there is something intensely distasteful, disturbing justice system of other countries. And we have always had our justice system to distinguish from those other countries. Judges were independent, prosecutors abided by the law. You didn't get your friends off and punish your enemies. And I think we're at a real inflection point that may no longer be the case, at least under this president. And I wonder, as we wrap up, having been general counsel of the FBI, whether this, just on an emotional level, is very disturbing, very worrisome to you and to many of your former colleagues.
I always tell anecdotes. Let me tell you a quick anecdote that relates to exactly what you're saying. Years ago, I was invited to a conference in Russia, in Leningrad, and it was about the rule of law. And the then president at a luncheon said, I know for many of you, this is aspiration, that you will think this conference is aspirational on our part, which I thought was remarkable that he said that. It was not Putin at the time. And I was on a panel and I'm not a judge, but everyone else on the panel was a judge from all around the globe. And there was a very eminent UK judge on the panel. And when we were walking back to the hotel, we just remarked how both of us had come from this very rule of law tradition, and we were so used to it being, it's a huge scandal if you heard about someone bribing a judge, or that the idea of paying bribes was something that we weren't saying it never happened in the United States or never happened in the UK, but it would be a big deal. Whereas I still remember on our panel, one of the judges from country said, I'm so proud of the fact during my 40 years on the bench, no one ever accused me of corruption. And like that was like considered the badge of honor.
Yes.
Whereas, that in our country, you were thinking of greats like Justice Brennan or Justice Marshall, but there are also conservative greats. I mean, Justice Frankfurter. I mean, it's bipartisan in that sense.
Yes.
And you realize we sort of walk back thinking that, we are so privileged because we really are a small subset of what is going on globally, and that we felt so lucky to be in rule of law countries where we took it for granted that again, there were imperfections, but the norm, the vast majority, the gravitational pull was that the facts and law matter, that if you're right, you win. If you're wrong, you lose. Again, I'm not trying to be naive and say that we have a perfect system, but it just wasn't. The idea was that the person who pays the most wins. And this is, just taking it back to where we started with Pam Bondi, by getting rid of basically the FCPA statute, which is Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, is basically saying that's a statute that bans committing bribes or giving bribes to win foreign contracts. And it's basically just saying, there's going to be law of the jungle. This idea of bribery and corruption is the new coin of the realm, is, I think, unfortunately, where we are. And as I keep saying, I think the roots of democracy and the roots of the rule of law were really not as deep as we thought they were.
And I think we are left just where you began, with the press the public and the courts. And we'll see if those three factors are able to push back and to maintain our system, which I agree entirely we have taken for granted for far too long. Thank you, Andrew, for being with us and all of your expertise. I say this not as a personal matter, but unfortunately, I suspect you will be back and commenting on what I'm sure, as you say, is going to be a very, very hard 4 years. So thank you for joining us.
It's my privilege, and I keep saying this, but thank you and Norm. It's so important to have independent voices, whether people agree with it or not. That is what the First Amendment's about, and it's really good to know that there's a place where people can come and speak up and say what they think, regardless of whether everyone agrees with all of it or some of it. So thank you for the service.
Our pleasure. We'll see you next time.